Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this Beyond Father's Day online gathering, where we'll be speaking about why urgent action is needed to improve father involvement in South Africa and how we might go about making this happen. My name is 𝗳𝗁𝘀𝗲𝗿, and I represent an organization called Innovation Edge. We are an impact-first investor focused on solving early childhood challenges in South Africa. Now, some of the themes we'll be exploring in today's webinar include disrupting the pervasive absent father narrative by focusing instead on father involvement. We'll take a look at fatherhood across generations and the effect of intergenerational norms and behaviors. We'll also take a look at what might it take to broaden notions of fatherhood to include social fathers, and we'll speak to what social fathers are, or rather who social fathers are. We'll hear throughout the webinar from a number of organizations, all part of putting together this event today, and that are all deeply embedded in father-focused work. And towards the end, hopefully, I'm going to try and manage time well. Hopefully, we'll have time to unmute the participants in the call, and we would welcome reflections, thoughts, and your perspectives on fatherhood in South Africa. I would also like to encourage everybody on the call to please use the chat functionality throughout the webinar. As you hear things that inspire interesting thoughts, pop them down in the chat, pop your questions in. Let's get the conversation flowing in the chat as well. It will certainly add, I think, to the richness of today's event. Now, I want to start off by setting the tone, and I'm going to start off with reading an excerpt. It's from a winning essay in a children's and young people's essay competition. It was run last year by the 𝗯𝘀𝗲𝗄 Literacy Trust in collaboration with Heartlines. It was originally published on a site called 𝗯𝘀𝗲𝗄𝗄𝗏. I'm just going to read a bit of this essay to you. And it's called Dad with a Plan, and the author is 𝗳𝗁𝗀𝗄𝗏𝗏. I sat there for hours, staring at the blank page in front of me, drowned in frustration. It was a simple maths problem, an easy sum that anyone can do. Not for me, clearly. I'd come to realize, 4 hours into my calculations, I felt helpless. I had absolutely no idea of what to do. Eventually, my struggle turned to tears, and God knows what would have happened had my father not come to my aid in that exact moment. That is what a father is to me, a figure to look up to, a superhero in disguise. The support, the sincere love and belonging I feel around him is overwhelming in the best way. When I didn't think I was capable, when I perceived my dreams to be too big, he assures me that it is most certainly possible and that anything I could dream of is indeed possible. I ask us all to really think carefully about what we as individuals, as members of society, need to be doing more of, or perhaps need to be doing differently to ensure that more children and more fathers benefit from the kind of relationship that 𝗳𝗁 has had with his dad. And with that, I'm going to invite Heartlines, or ḽeReko, sorry, from Heartlines, to chat to us about their work and share with us a video as well. Go ahead, ḽeReko.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you to Sonke, 𝗁𝘀𝗵𝗲𝗿, and the rest of your team for really putting us together on such an important event. And in many ways, happy belated Father's Day to many of the fathers that are here. Such an important day that is really worth celebrating. I am going to just share a little bit about our organization, Fathers Matter from Heartlines, and then there will be a video at the end that just expresses the kind of work that we do around story. So Fathers Matter is a Heartlines project that supports the positive role of men in the lives of their children. And often the question that really kickstarted this project is, why do fathers matter? Our CEO, 𝗳𝘁𝗵𝗿, likes to ask, if amongst a group of people, do mothers matter? And you often find that people agree that mothers matter, but often when you ask, do fathers matter? Often you get a mixed response from people. So we were really engaging with that question, why fathers matter. And so we found that men's active positive presence means improved educational outcomes for children across the world. When men are involved in the lives of their children, there's a reduction in risk of violence. Also, we have a situation with GBV in the country. We found that fatherly involvement is a preventative measure towards that. Also, another thing is less risk of substance abuse, less risk of teenage pregnancy, and reduced levels of suicide and mental health issues. Often with Fathers Matter, we look at our target audience. We like to say, in the next couple of years, we'd like to get into that age group of 12 to 18, but currently our primary target is men and women 19 to 35. And then over the next couple of years, we're gearing into the 12 to 18 range. And then our secondary audience is really key influencers, institutions such as the church, community leaders, teachers, older family members, people who have a stake within this conversation of fatherhood in the country. And then when it comes to barriers to presence, often the age-old conversation around why are fathers not involved in the lives of their children? Often the response is, men are deadbeat dads, disinterested, uninterested from playing a role in the lives of their children. But we did a year's worth of research around this subject, and we found that actually there's quite pointed reasons why a lot of fathers are not involved in their children's lives. We found that number one is knowledge gap. We like to joke that often when you give a father a newborn baby and nappies, they'll find a way to turn that into a vest because they don't know how to use them. So there's quite a knowledge gap with fathers being unable to know how to physically father, how to physically be involved in the lives of their children. So that's one of the barriers to presence. Most of them were not fathered themselves. And so in our country, how do we expect fathers who are not fathered to be able to know how to practically execute that role? Then secondly is resources. We don't have much resources around that men can gain in terms of helping them to practically be able to play with their children. And we found that in a lot of our workshops, men ask, okay, what do I do with my children? What do I do with them once I'm left with them in the home? And so there's a lack of resources that we found in the field. And then another barrier is culture and gender. In some of our cultures, we know that there is what we call 𝗯𝘀𝗲𝗲𝗄𝗏. So often when a man impregnates a woman, the woman's family will expect him to pay. There's a word, they call it damages, but there's been a challenge to that word as of late. But they will expect them to pay a fee for impregnating a woman. And so often in our unemployment crisis, men who are not working, they will be unable to pay that 𝗯𝘀𝗲𝗏𝗄𝗏 fee, which then means they will not be able to be there in the lives of their children. And then which leads to the number one reason that we found is that it's finances. Finances are the main barrier for fatherly involvement, for fathers being there in the lives of their children. We are in an unemployment crisis. Men are simply not working. Men are simply unable to provide. And in our country, men are seen as primary providers. And if a man is unable to provide, his presence in the life of his children is just really deemed unnecessary. So those are some of the barriers to presence. Some of our objectives really as Fathers Matter is to try and improve knowledge, challenge attitudes, and increase dialogue. We do that currently through we have a podcast series, we have workshops that we are running, and then also I'll talk about it a little bit later, or rather in a minute or so, just around the films that we're doing with CABC. The second objective is really to provide accessible information and skills. The first 1,000 days, we found that if a father is involved in the life of his child in the first 1,000 days, most often he'll be able to stay for the rest of that child's life. So just important to be able to give men resources to be able to know what to do in that very critical stage. Number 3 is to develop programs to support men in places of faith, to inspire and educate and equip ECD teachers. We're currently working on an ECD project. How can ECD centers, early childhood development centers, encourage fathers to be there and to be involved in the lives of their children? And then number 5, to strengthen networks, people, organizations in the sector. Pretty much what Sonke has done today, we're very much doing that as well, just bringing and bridging organizations in the field so that we assist each other and we continue to elevate this conversation on fatherhood in the country. And then number 6, to monitor, evaluate, and learn. There must always be a progressive thrust in this conversation of fatherhood. Lastly, as I stop sharing before we get into the video, we have really an exciting 17th September date, which is the date that SABC has given us to launch 6 short films around fatherhood. As Heartlines, we're currently in production, scripted in-house 6 fatherhood films that are going to be spotlighted on SABC2 with a repeat show on SABC3. 17th September is the date for the initial short film. These are fatherhood, engaging, critical, controversial subject of fatherhood in the country, and we're really looking forward for the whole nation to engage in this powerful conversation. This is the next video, one of our promos around fatherhood.
I think I had a pretty cool, open childhood with my dad.
My dad makes sure that I eat before I go to school.
It's constantly being aware that someone's got your back no matter what. There was no doubt in my mind about that.
And he takes us some fun holidays.
The rule was I could date anyone but no one who drove a motorbike. I broke that rule.
The biggest challenge facing fathers today is the busyness of life. It's the rat race. It's this pressure to perform. It's this also pressure to provide for their families.
I grew up with an absent father. Not a typical absent father, was never there. A father that was at home, present, but never present in my life. How do we learn those lessons that in a way got so messed up as we grew up?
The church is very vital in training men, especially in a broken society like ours, South Africa.
We have a lot of social fathers who play a very positive role. You may have grandparents, uncles that you grew up with. You may have teachers whom you see as your role model.
Women, they have that knowledge base where they're able to talk because of the way women discuss things and they talk, so they can bounce. Dads generally don't. Men generally don't.
And that's one of the biggest challenges right now for us as men. We are isolated. We don't want to talk about stuff. And so we don't get to share. We don't get to be vulnerable. And we don't get to be accountable in that space. So we don't have mentors.
We've got a WhatsApp group where dads can join and dads can pretty much vent, they can discuss, they can bounce ideas off each other.
The only way that we're going to start to unravel these things if we're able to sit down and talk and dialogue, talk about things that have, I want to say, more substance to it, as opposed to kind of sitting in a bar, drinking beer and talking about sport.
There's a lot of posts about mothers doing well, but nothing really about fathers. Fatherhood Friday primarily is just to celebrate being a father.
We need programs that promote positive fatherhood, where fathers were involved in changing their children's nappies, in taking their children for vaccination.
If you're not present in your child's life, it's never too late to start.
Thank you so much, Lereko, for sharing and for that fantastic video. And what a wonderful reminder that it's never too late to start. And we look forward to the 17th of September on SABC2 to have a look at those 6 videos. I'd now like to hand over to Jenna Lee and Jeff from the Center for Analytics and Behaviour Change, quite a mouthful, CABC. Jenna, over to you.
Great, thanks so much for the introduction. I'm Jenna ḽi-ŝragnell, and my background is in psychology, narrative therapy, and peace building, and engaging men to prevent violence, and in the intergenerational cycle of violence and fatherhood, and teaching nonviolent parenting. So at the Center for Analytics and Behaviour Change, we have our CABC project, which is using social media to understand gender-based violence and fatherhood, and to create interventions around these issues. So what we have is we have powerful social media listening tools which allow us to pull in vast amounts of data and research different narratives. So in this case, we are researching gender-based violence and fatherhood. And in this specific incident today, we're talking about fatherhood. So from these research tools, we can see all the different themes that people are talking about on public social media. So some of the themes that have come up are the pressure that men feel to be providers to their families, ATM dads, gender norms around providing financially but not being involved in caregiver roles, the barriers that fathers are facing to be involved in their children's lives, and all these different conversations around single fathers, around the intergenerational cycle of trauma and pain, and mental health around men and fathers. So this allows us to pull in so much data, unfiltered data, so we can see what people are saying, and get all these different themes, which will then allow us to have data-driven interventions. It also allows us to see all the authors in the conversation, who are the people involved in the conversation on public social media, who are the influencers. It allows us to pull in a vast amount of different metrics, like breakdowns between ages, between languages, and also different geographic locations, where there are hotspots of conversations that are happening. We can also see the conversation over time, how that conversation changes, what causes spikes in conversations, and also set like a baseline study, which I will talk about later in the monitoring and evaluation. But as I mentioned, all this research is to give us opportunities to intervene, and a lot of that is around dialogue facilitation and content creation. So we use these social media listening tools to identify thousands of men on social media who are already on side. For example, last year in our pilot study, in the space of 6 weeks, we identified 10,500 men who were speaking out against gender-based violence, and those were our change agents. And the same around fatherhood. We identify men who are on side. We invite them to come and see we then send a messaging saying, we see you, we stand with you, come take action, come do the skill kits on our website. On our website, we have dialogue facilitation training, which teaches men to have conversations with other men, and fathers and men to have conversations with each other. There's also dialogue facilitation content that they can share on their social media channels, WhatsApps, to start conversations with other men about important topics. There's a dialogue deck which they can use, and also inspiration of how to respond. And this is developed across 4 different language contexts. We also have a team of in-house dialogue facilitators who are engaging online, supporting the change agents with positive comments and resharing, and also engaging with men who are antagonists, who are promoting problematic narratives, and getting them through dialogue facilitation online into a process of self-reflection and healing. So we're getting men to speak out around misogyny, gender-based violence, and issues of fatherhood. And what's important to note, this isn't once off. Once we have these men's social media addresses, we send them more messaging, we invite them to join Facebook groups, WhatsApp groups, and we are continuously bringing in thousands of more men through these social media listening tools, but also through sectorial engagement, and we are holding them in process over time. And through this reiterative process, we are able to shift the narrative in this space. What's also very exciting is these social media listening tools allow us to do such powerful monitoring and evaluation. We can set baseline studies to see how we've affected the conversation and shifted narratives, and we can pull out a vast amount of metrics. For example, on your screen, you can see in a space of 2 hours, our team of in-house dialogue facilitators were able to reach 154,000 people and have a total impressions of 385,000. And we also have all the metrics pulled from our website, from who's viewing our skill kits and engaging with our content. So over to you, Nicole and Jeff.
Thanks so much, Jenny. Jeff, I'd like to ask you certainly a question, perhaps a couple of questions if we have time. You know, Lereka was speaking about how do we expect fathers to be able to father adequately when they themselves haven't been fathered. Generally, you know, you were just speaking about the intergenerational cycles of trauma and violence. And Jeff, I was wondering if you could perhaps tell us some more about that intergenerational cycle of violence, and how are fathers sort of passing on violent behavior to boys in particular, and what do we do? How do we heal this?
Thank you, Nicole, and the people present. Nicole, fathers, with the assistance of broader community, are the facilitators of intergenerational violence. And this is done through the socialization of the boy child, through the rites of passage, through cultural demands, through religious demands that are imposed and reinforced in young men. When we talk about intercultural violence, we talk about patterns that have been observed in different generations of family and sometimes communities. And because society places young men and men above the position of women and children. And for those men to retain that position, they resort to violence to ensure that position and to intimidate and to instill fear in men, in women, and the boy child. And manhood in society, especially by men, is measured by the amount of toxic masculinity that is in society. Who can you beat? You don't listen to a woman. one can listen to a language that young boys, I'm talking about children, when they talk about a sister or a girl who's older than they will say lomdana, lengane lena, this child. I mean, it's a boy of 9 talking about a 13-year-old. And it's normal, and nobody would say, why do you call them a child? And in fact, that behavior, that language is praised and reinforced. The kind of things that young men witness at home, the domestic violence, and the fact that sometimes the mother's got no recourse to justice and no steps are taken when the mother is beaten up. Those are the kind of things that reinforce the thought that it is okay to be violent and to use violence against women and men. So in that manner, that violence is passed on from one generation to another generation. So you find, to a certain extent, the relationship in certain communities or in certain families between the father and the child is based on that violence. The father uses violence om die klein seun sterk te maak, as we would say in Afrikaans, to make you a man. You use violence. And it's a very sort of tragic and sad situation that you'd find that men or young boys would say, yeah, my father taught me to be a man. That's why I'm strong as I am. So that kind of violence is then passed on because the young man is going to pass on those kind of values, behavior, and attitude to his children. And the woman, on the other hand, because of the situation that she finds herself in, would teach women, like we find in certain societies, there are even expressions and idioms for women that says, emzini kuyanyamezelwa, meaning you've got to bear these kind of things to be a real wife or woman. So there are these intergenerational things. I mean, even religion, some religion, Bible extracts reinforce that. And we know we're a very religious society as South Africans. Yeah. So the effects then come at a very high cost, come at the cost of mental and emotional health of women, come at the cost of high dropout rates for girls, children, and women, comes at the rate of increased homelessness amongst women and young girls, come at a very high cost in terms of treating abuse and violence related illnesses by government. So it comes at the cost of rape being normalized. As you can see how the practice of uthwala has been distorted, where rape is called uthwala, and it is not. So society does not respond to that because it has become normal. And then when you look at what is called the bad boy syndrome, where if you don't, some women believe that if you don't beat me, then you don't love me. So it's a very weird and very unfortunate kind of situation. So these are the kind of effects that one finds in society around intergenerational violence.
Thank you, Jeff. I mean, it's certainly a complex issue with so many different facets. You're speaking about the patterns of observed behavior, the languages, the norms and beliefs. And I wish we had more time to continue this conversation with you. But unfortunately, we have to move on to our next speaker. So I really want to thank you for your insights and also for the passion that you are displaying in speaking about this, but also in tackling this challenge. Thank you, Jeff. I want to now hand over to Wanda, and I'm not sure if Prof. Ratele is with us, but if he is, I'll be inviting some conversation there, and of course also with ÄZL. But I think, Wanda, that you are going to take us away and share with us some more insights from your report.
Afternoon, colleagues. Thanks for inviting us as the editors of the State of South African Fathers Report 2021. I would like to acknowledge our fellow authors for the State of South African Fathers report. We could not have done this without them, and we would thank them so much. Moving into the presentation, colleagues, I'm going to focus on key messages from the State of South African Fathers Report 2021. And this is 𝗳𝗁𝘀𝗵𝗲𝗿 and Dr. van der Berg and Professor Ratele are also here to take questions whenever, colleagues. So we actually think that the most important key messages from the State of South African Fathers Report were focusing on fatherhood beyond biology. And this means that we know that the determinants of fatherhood extend beyond biology, that's extending beyond conception. And we know that in most households, men live with children who are not biologically theirs. Most men, we actually find, may live in a household where they're looking after children who are not biologically theirs, but somewhere else, those children, their biological children, might be living in another household. And these men are called social fathers. They may be uncles, brothers, stepfathers. And we also have community members who play a critical fathering roles to children who are not biologically related to them. And we're looking at teachers, pastors, coaches, life coaches, etc. So, and these men play critical fatherhood roles in terms of financial, social, and cultural. And we need to then acknowledge that in South Africa and elsewhere in Africa, fatherhood and in the world, fatherhood now goes beyond conception to focus on other men who are conducting these fathering roles for children. Next slide, please. So I think this is particularly important in the South African context, where we've got a large number of children living in households without their biological father. Fatherhood goes beyond residency. We've seen most reports, particularly in states SA, and we're now beginning to kind of move away from this notion of father absence, and particularly then focusing on co-residents and non-residents, which we say, okay, fatherhood extends beyond father-child residence. Some fathers, 70% of fathers in South Africa do not live in a household with their biological children. And yes, this is a huge number, but it does not equate to not being involved, does not equate to lack of involvement, does not equate to absence or lack of care or lack of love. Most fathers, we know that, are actually quite involved in one way or the other in providing care and support for their children, even when they do not reside with them. And we also acknowledge the fact that having a father in a household does not necessarily equate to involvement. We've got some fathers who are in a household and are very violent, abusive to both children and their parents and their mothers. And so this notion of co-residence equating to absence is something that we're considering to be a misnomer, particularly in the current context in South Africa. Next slide, Dr. 𝗳𝗁𝘀𝗵𝗲𝗿. So colleagues, we acknowledge also that fatherhood is very important for men. Most fathers want to be involved in their children's lives, and in some that's in some way or the other where they can. And we know that also fathers have got key challenges that they face in their fathering roles, and we need to establish how this may be addressed. I'll give an example of the great strides that we made with paternity leave. Yes, paternity leave in South Africa is very important for fathers who are working and who have formal jobs. But we also have other interventions that we need to focus on. So we need to look at the different circumstances faced by individual men as fathers and need to avoid a one-size-fits-all. And here we need to look at those fathers who are unemployed, teenage fathers, same-sex fathers, and so we need to address the different kind of challenges that are faced by men as fathers, in particularly focusing on their exact kind of like wishes, interests, and context. Next slide, please. So colleagues, take-home message. So we need dedicated efforts to meet the context and age-specific needs of fathers in South Africa. Next slide. So finally, we want to say, let's not leave anyone behind. Let's create complementary rather than competing interventions for mothers and fathers. This way, we then kind of like bring together the needs of mothers and fathers to ensure that children are the beneficiaries of this family environment that we want to set up in South Africa. So these interventions are critical, even in the context of competing socioeconomic, structural, and health priorities. I would like to say, let's not lose hope. If we let go now, we lose at least 2 decades of hard work. So colleagues, aluta continua. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tawanda, indeed, and thank you for those very, very valuable insights. 𝗳𝘁𝗵𝗲𝗿, I'm curious, we're here together having this conversation about urgency around improving and increasing father involvement. And I mean, I'd like to think that we've created somewhat of a safe space to have this conversation, but I'm curious as to what happens when you go into the broader public domain and start having conversations like this one, in the work that you do. What have you found challenging, insightful? What have you found encouraging?
Thanks, Nicole, and thanks for the presentation, Tawanda and colleagues. So, Nicole, I think this webinar is one of the signs that there is an emerging conversation about men's contribution to care in South Africa and the value of that. And I do think that what we're hearing from 𝗳𝗁𝘂𝗲𝗄 from CABC and from Heartlines is a shift from the conversation of whether a father is simply physically present in a household to the strong focus on the relationship between a man and a child. In other words, father involvement. That is coming up more and more. The policy changes are encouraging, but I think also on some of the radio work that colleagues are doing and some of the television work, we are seeing the encouraging trend that people are more and more realizing the importance of the relationship as the important guiding factor. Thanks, Nicole.
No, thank you very much, 𝗳𝘁𝗵𝗲𝗿, for those insights. Our previous speaker was speaking about the pervasive violence that exists in South Africa. And I mean, recently we had reports being released, and, I won't go into the horror of those statistics, but I mean, I don't think we can shy away from the conversation. I'm just curious, and I'm not sure if Prof. Ratel is on the call or who wants to take this question, but what did the report actually find about fathers and violence?
Let's just check if Kopano is on.
I'm online, yes. Thank you, Nicole. It's taking a little while to turn on.
There we go. Welcome.
Thank you. And thanks again for facilitating this. It's a question that you posed to us that has several layers to it, as you might well know. But to start where Tawanda, just to emphasize something Tawanda said, in the way we think we have thought about father absence in the report, is that it is better sometimes to have a father who's physically absent in the family if that father is violent. I mean, it's a trade-off right there. So some of the authors in the report, including myself in a substantive chapter, look at a kind of continuum of violence. And as you quite well know, the the levels, the rates of violence in South Africa are just astronomical. I mean, they're incredible. And one of the examples I tend to give is it would be better to live in Sicily in the 80s, 70s, where the mafia was well known to be violent, because the rates in Italy, even today, are I think, more than 20 times lower than South Africa. That's just incredible, right? So if you have, I didn't look at the rates for today's talk. So if you have rates about 30 per 100,000, and in a country like Italy, they are just under 1 sometimes per 100,000. It's incredible. It's so this is something that we all know, that South Africa is so the kinds of violence is quite complicated. And so let me just say two things. One is men's violence, and we always have to say men's violence. Men's violence against women, that's the one part about it. And then so this is direct violence, men's violence against women, and then against children, their own or other people's children. And then the third part about this is men's violence against other men, which is, as you quite well know, the magnitude of that, again, is just incredible. If you look at the numbers that we just saw, again, in the last few weeks from the Minister of Police. And this is also not uniformly distributed. It's distributed in certain parts of the country, as you know, and you can see the police stations, as they mentioned: Delft, 𝗳𝗁𝘁, Alexander, I think in Aseta Joburg. So you can go on and on and mention this. So, and if you map who lives in those areas, clearly there are Black people there. There are people who are called colored, but basically Black people in all of this. They tend to be younger men again. And so that's one form of violence, and that is a compacted violence, men's violence against women, against children, against other men, but also, as you know from the COVID data we've been seeing, men's violence against themselves, or suicide rates in South Africa, again, are quite high. So you have there's 4 kinds of forms of violence, direct violence, and all of them, of course, have a relationship, direct or indirect, with fatherhood. But what we don't have is a very specific kinds of data, only now coming out in 1 or 2 surveys of men who are fathers, who are either perpetrators of violence or victims of violence. And that is one area we need to, I guess, going forward, just to concentrate a lot more, because it has all kinds of implications. If you're a father and you have violence either in your own history perpetrated against you, that, as Jeff was saying, it might have intergenerational kinds of trajectories. Of course, there's agency here. You can always find way, or not, you cannot always, but there is a possibility of finding a way to interrupt that if you find support in society, or among, if you find, if you will, affection or love or support about this. So that's that kind of violence. But then there's the violence clearly of these men doing violence to their children, which again perpetuates that. So let me park there, right? And then there's this other kind of violence, which is a little more tricky to, as you might well know, when we're looking at the numbers of violence in South Africa, we're talking about direct violence, so bodily violence, violence against property, as you saw in Natal. But we don't want to talk about what people call slow violence. I was driving through Cape Town yesterday, and as I was driving on Ruland Street, the number of mostly men, there are women, but mostly men who are on the streets, it's just incredible. It feels like it's much more than it's ever been. If you drive on main road again, you will see the poverty. And this has an impact, not just psychological, material, right? They have inadequate shelter, meaning the state is not caring enough, doing enough to support these men and women and their children, and the chances of making a dent into men and women, but now we're focusing specifically on men as fathers and their children, of making a dent, of reducing both that kind of violence, the violence of structures, of systems, but also the direct violence is huge. And so in the chapter on violence and fathers and violence, we try to open this up, and hopefully the kinds of work that we do around fatherhood and fathers' involvement in children's lives will be unafraid to tackle this quite complex problem of violence of our society, in our society, of our society.
Prof, thank you so much for so eloquently unpacking that for us and for reminding us about the different layers. Not easy to hear, but important conversations to have. And I would imagine, in fact, I think I can say I know that there is no one sector organization that can solve for this. And so I want to move to our next speakers and really invite Mpho and Patrick to speak to us about Men Care South Africa. And in particular, I know there's some interesting partnerships that I want to ask some questions around, but perhaps first to Mpho, invite you to share with us about the project and Patrick, what you've learned.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Vessel, could you help put the slide up? So my name is ཙ𝗯𝘀𝗲𝗵𝗲𝗿, and I work at Sonke Gender Justice as a regional coordinator. I also am one of 4 Men Care Global co-coordinators. So I'll briefly speak about Men Care Global at the global level before I hand over to my colleague who will speak about the Men Care work that we are doing in South Africa. So Men Care is a global fatherhood campaign that is active in more than 50 countries on 5 continents, and it's being coordinated by Equimundo, which was previously known as Promundo, as well as Sonke Gender Justice. Men Care has been in existence for more than 10 years. We recently celebrated 10 years last year. So it was launched in the year 2011. So the mission really, why Men Care came into place was to promote men's involvement as equitable, non-violent fathers. And I guess the narrative that we're hearing today just shows the importance of, having fathers who are involved in children's lives and the benefits that really come with that. And also with Men Care, we also want men to be caregivers, which is something that over time we've seen quite a positive number of men doing that. I traveled last weekend. It was so heartwarming to see a father who was carrying a newborn baby at the airport. They were having 3 children, toddlers actually. So it's something that before was quite a taboo, but for us to actually see it, I was really excited to see that men are really taking that role of caregiving, which is what Men Care aims to do. And in order to achieve that family well-being and gender equality and better health for mothers, fathers, and children, just like what the previous speakers have been speaking about, that it is for the betterment of the children and for the family at large. And also as Men Care, we aim for men to be allies in supporting women's social and economic equality, in part by taking part on more responsibility on childcare and domestic work. So we have quite a number of work that we've done globally around advocacy on advocating for parental leave, which has been something that here in South Africa we have managed to do. We also have quite a number of resources. Please, if you get time, there's the link, www.mencare.org. So I want to hand over to my colleague, Dapet, who's going to take us through on the amazing work that we have been doing here in South Africa. Dapet, over to you.
Thanks, my colleague. Thanks, Mpho. Good afternoon, Nicole. Good afternoon to everyone that is here present. A special greetings to my family. I saw my wife walking in. I saw my young men also checking in on the webinar. Hearty welcome for that. Mine is to give just briefly an introduction. But before I do that, this afternoon we received some horrifying numbers that in our country, 1,029 young men aged between 10 and 16 are awaiting trial for the charge of rape. And this discussion, it's more than long overdue. It's more needed in every space of our society. There's something fundamentally missing in our society. Friends and colleagues, if we look at the term family, family is being viewed as one of the most essential components of our community and forms of setting for demographic and reproduction, primary socialization. It is primary source for material, psychosocial support for each family member. Stable and supportive families where fathers and mothers are equally involved with parenting their children, have adequate parenting skills, are associated with several positive outcomes for individual members and the wider society. These include higher levels of self-esteem, lower levels of antisocial behavior such as crime, violence, substance abuse, higher levels of work productivity, lower levels of stress, more self-efficacy to deal with socioeconomic hardships. Next slide, Vesa. MenCare in South Africa was launched in South Africa in the year 2011 in Cape Town. I remember that event. We had about 272 representatives from almost 45 countries across the globe. The idea behind MenCare 50/50 seeks to accelerate men's uptake of 50% of unpaid care work by 2030. That's our ambitious goal. With 50 minutes of more care work per man per day. It is now happening in 5 provinces in South Africa and a number of countries in our beautiful continent, Africa. Gender equality and better health for mothers, fathers, and children. 80% of men will become fathers in their lifetime. Nearly all men will have a chance to become involved in the life of a child. MenCare campaign support diversity of fathers, including same-sex parents, men who take caregiving roles, such as brothers, coaches, priests, and other friends. Next slide, Vesa. Thank you. We are collaborating with governmental departments, but specifically now I'll talk about Department of Social Services nationally. The campaign has strengthened DSD, their current program on families. It started in Free State, Gauteng, and now brought to Eastern Cape by the National DSD, KZN, Northern Cape, Northwest, and Limpopo. It was also highlighted to be a groundbreaking initiative in the State of the Province address in Free State by the Honorable ཙ𝗯𝘀𝗵𝗲𝗿. Each province has sent 15 to 25 social workers who are professionals, including community-based organization partners, to be trained as facilitators in their respective districts. You know, for the fact that in Free State, there are about 5 districts. Gauteng, there are about 5 districts as well. We have limited facilitators, but we always welcome to see CBOs joining hands in making sure that we roll out the program. And after this training, social professional services and CBOs are then rolling out the 50/50 MenCare parenting program to couples in the respective districts. And also, it is worth mentioning that the work with media has actually assisted us in a great deal. We are able to reach out to large scale of viewers and listeners at a given goal. Thanks, Vesa. Well, I would want to respond this when I'm responding to your questions, Nicole.
Thank you so much, Pat. It's so wonderful. Also that your family could join us, and I really love that you welcomed them. I'm just curious if you can maybe share with us sort of 1 or 2 examples of sort of personal experiences, if you can, of change that's happened, perhaps with somebody who's participated, somebody from a group, perhaps, if you can.
Sure. Thank you so much. Let me first talk about my own personal journey, because this kind of work has actually enabled me to be a better parent than what I've actually experienced as a child. Jeff spoke about intergenerational violence transferred from one generation to the next. You know, I am from that kind of background where I have seen my father many a times beating up my mom. And I've never seen him kissing up my mom in front of us. And this was done in the name of culture, and he's the head of the family. You know, which lessons are we taking from that? I've actually seen those guys, but now doing the actual parenting in my own time, I have vowed to do it differently. And it is a learning in progress all the time. But also sharing some of the experiences shared by the beneficiaries of the program in Free State in particular, when we were launching the Men-Care 50/50 parenting program in September 2021. One attendee said, the parenting sessions together has enabled them as a boyfriend and girlfriend to realize their blind spot and their weaknesses. And now they can reflect upon them jointly. And now they view themselves as better beings. Those couples were coming from Mangaung, one of the dusty townships of Free State. One reported that always believed that the kitchen and care work was a responsibility of women. The training has actually enabled him to finding mental shift, as care work is good for men too. It strengthened the family to have a healthy lifestyle, you know. And the last one that I've actually recorded, spending time with my family, especially children, has made me to earn respect, and not only at home, but to the broader society. That was a wonderful learning experience shared by one man in the launch. So gradually we are making inroads, you know. But also I want to share that we ought to be telling more positive stories about fathers, because there's something out there that is happening. Well, we are challenged by a number of daunting challenges of violence against men's violence against women and children, and structural violence, men's violence against other men. But I think it is very, very important whenever we find time, extrapolate these kinds of lessons to say something is happening in our country. And this shift, we commit it to happen in our lifetime.
Thank you, Pat. I'm going, and I'm realizing you can't hear me giving you the encouragement, but I hope you can feel it with my nodding. And thank you for the reminder that indeed change is possible, and that it is important, as much as it's important to speak about the ills of society, it's important to elevate, as you were saying, the examples of positive fathering that are already happening. And thank you for also sharing your personal story. It's so important. If I may, I think we have time for another question. Actually, I want to ask ÄZ̲, if you don't mind, I want to ask ÄZ̲ a question, just something that's occurred. And I'm just curious as to whether or not, or in what way, work with fathers influences women's rights.
Thanks, Nicole. I'm really happy that you're raising that. Of course it does. I think this is one of the big reasons that Sonke Gender Justice works with fatherhood as a component of our work in the Men Care campaign. A major area where it does have a significant influence is on who takes responsibility for the unpaid care work in a house, and who takes responsibility for financial care for a child. Women's rights, you know, we've often seen, and I think this was quite clear from the State of South Africa's Fathers report as well, that mothers in South Africa often end up being the head of the household and the caregiver of a child. And when I say head, I mean actually the breadwinner. So both the breadwinner and a caregiver. What often happens, and I think this is unfortunate, is that the burden of care, or the experience of violence that women experience and the experience of violence that men experience are weighed against each other. And it becomes this false debate between who is the greater victim here. Are men a greater victim than women, or are women a greater victim than men? And I think that's unfortunate because it's much more complex than that. I do think that, as Kopano said, you know, men do experience significant violence, but it's mostly men who are perpetrating violence. So an opportunity that fatherhood offers is, I often talk about fatherhood as a Trojan horse for gender equality. It's a way to start a connection. It's a way to make a connection to men that's very personal, and then can allow them to understand the value of care, attachment, and just simply doing the hard work of childcare as a way to actually improve their relationships. But it also then benefits women in terms of reducing the burden of care on women's rights. So yeah, thanks for raising that.
Thank you very much, Wessel. I think we mentioned at the beginning, and I think Wessel shared in the chat, that we would have the opportunity also to hear from the other participants, not the presenters. Of course, the presenters are also welcome to weigh in, but just wanting to make space for participants to not necessarily respond to a question, but anything that you'd like to respond to with regards to what you've heard so far, any insights you've had. I'm sure there are others on the call who also do work with fathers. And I want to sort of encourage us as we move into this open dialogue to really lean heavily into the rules of respect for each other. We can certainly have the tough conversations, but please let's do so with great respect. Now, I don't know the technicalities. I think we can, if people raise hands, we'll be able to spotlight them. Let's give it a go. Are there any comments or questions from the virtual floor, as it were? Apologies for the delay. I'm peering into at my screen to try and see the hands. So please forgive me. I see we have two hands. I see we have Colleen's hand and we have Gary's hand.
So can we maybe go to Colleen first?
Yeah, let's do that.
Sorry, let me just.
Hi. Hi. Good afternoon, everybody. Can I speak?
Yes, we can hear you. Welcome, Colleen.
Okay. Thanks for an informative discussion that's happening. I was very interested to see that Heartlines is working in terms of the early childhood development sector field. I'm a firm believer that fathers play a pivotal role in the development of their children. And I'd like to believe that my school is in a sort of a middle class environment. So we have children at our school where I believe that the boys should play with dolls and prams and in the fantasy area. And I had a dad one day lose his nut because his child was pushing a pram and mothering a doll. And I asked him what was his reason. He said, but my child should play with cars. So I said, but Dad, he's learning to be a father. He's learning to be an uncle. He's nurturing a softer side of him. But his dad said, well, when I come here, I don't want to see him playing with a doll or a pram. So how does one get around the fact that fathers believe their children should be macho and that they shouldn't be exposed to this? So what I also introduce is I do a story once a month where I say that the dads must tell the story to the child so that we forge in a bond there as well. But when I look on the flip side of the coin in our poor communities and where gangsterism is rife, we have so many fatherless children because it seems to be that our young girls are just having babies. I mean, we have children as young as 10, 11 giving birth. How do we address that? And I'm always on the road when I see this, trying to encourage them, but we have this aggressive attitude of fathers that are in the gangsterhood environment who say that, you know, this is my child and I'm raising him like that. But at the same time also, how do we address this? Because about 4 years ago, I also had a family workshop where we worked with families for a period of 2 months, which was, they came in, they had supper, and then it was facilitated by a speaker who spoke about the values that should be in, but it was strengthening family partnerships, and it worked very well. Unfortunately, I think that there's not enough funding available for things like that. And I have worked with Heartlines and young people a few years ago. Could we not look at, you know, funding's always the issue when one wants to do things, but how do we change the narrative about fathers really being involved in their children's lives? And we also have, you know, something in the early childhood development sector where even the practitioners have this bias. No, the boys can't play with the doll, or they can't wear pink. So how do we change that mindset of our practitioners as well? You know, there are so many biases out there, but I think that we need to be more vocal about the fact that fatherhood is important. And I mean, children develop their fatherhood from the role models that they see, and we don't have very many good role models at the moment in our so-called poor communities. That's just my bit. But I'm watching the chat, and it's very interesting. So yeah, thanks for allowing me to share my little bit.
Colleen, thank you very much for sharing. And I'm wondering perhaps if I couldn't quickly just invite Lereko, if you wouldn't mind, speaking about Heartlines program, working with ECD practitioners to help them specifically around those biases that Colleen mentioned, to support them in communicating with fathers. If you wouldn't mind just briefly sharing about that program.
Thank you. Thanks, Colleen. It's such an important conversation, and every single father has varying degrees as to how far they are willing to stretch and challenge sort of the so-called gender stereotypes that we have. But I think I'd like to start by saying I think we need to firstly understand that not every father is willing to take that leap of faith and to trust that my son can play with dolls and not end up disappointing my whatever expectations I have of them. Not every father is willing to take that leap of faith. What we can do is to introduce them to conversations around why it's important for them to be able to take that leap of faith and to trust that it's good for the wholesome nature of their children to be able to be exposed to playing with different sorts of toys, playing with different genders, sexes, and challenge themselves as to why it's important for them to do that. So I guess it's to start off by saying we ourselves need to examine our own expectations with regards to that. Every parent has a right to to have that sort of understanding of themselves. Secondly, our ECD work is really geared towards the ECD practitioner. So we're not actually chatting to the parents, we're chatting to the ECD practitioners, the ECD centers, who they themselves may have some stereotypes that they need to challenge of themselves. We find that a lot of ECD centers, the WhatsApp groups only have the mothers there and not the dads. And you ask the ECD teacher, why don't you have the fathers there? And they'd come up with all sorts of excuses. But it all goes to the root of, I think mothers are the ones who are supposed to handle my children. So we work with ECD centers, try to educate them, try to give them resources, and try to show them how important it is for fathers to step up and to be present. And sometimes you find that fathers actually are looking for that opportunity, but are too shy to raise their hands and say, I'd like to also be helping my daughter with her homework. I'd also like to be helping her with varying things. So it's that's the kind of work that we're doing. We're working with ECD centers. One other thing, I see my colleague is here, but I don't want to put her under the spot. What I would do is I can just share some information. I can share an email that you can get into contact with, but we're really doing some progressive work with ECD centers. We think if they are able to reach the parents, then those important discussions will be had. Also, lastly, we find that fathers are willing to challenge their own stereotypes, and we found that fathers are not as stubborn as we think they are. I've been chatting to another sort of ambassador in the field. His name is Charlie Peterson, and he grew up without a father, but his mom taught him to wash dishes, to hang out the laundry. So we found that a lot of these men who grew up without fathers, they grow up in matriarchal structures that then teach them how to do so-called matriarchal or woman duties. And so there's a sort of a disconnect sometimes where a lot of these men say, yeah, I grew up with a single mother, but she taught me how to do whatever my sister could do or whatever a woman can do. It's just the disconnect becomes when they become adults and meet other men and so forth, and then sort of it's engineered in their psyche that, hey, whatever it is that you learned how to do is not a man's responsibility. But I'll try to put our contact details in the chat, and we can chat more about just the pointed work we do around ECD.
Thank you, Lerica. I see that your colleague is already one step ahead of you and has already popped the details in the chat.
Fantastic.
I'm going to, in a moment, hand over to Gary and to Terence, but also just to say that as Innovation Edge, what we've done is put together a data or an information repository, and we'll be sharing the link to that. It's a Google folder, to speak plain English. We'll be sharing the link with all participants after this webinar, and essentially it has all of the presentations, a whole bunch of resources, and so we encourage you to not just make use of that, but to add to that. So just to say that that will happen. If we can perhaps spotlight Gary and then Terence, those are the two hands that I see. Gary, I'm not sure if you are able, if you are unmuted. Perhaps just let us know in the chat if you aren't able to speak. Okay. Our technical gurus, if you can do your magic and unmute Gary. Wouldn't be a webinar if there wasn't some sort of technical difficulty. So.
I'm doing my best here.
That's fine.
I think it's just a question of clicking unmute on the other side.
Gary, are you able to unmute yourself?
I have made Gary a presenter, so it should be possible.
Oh, I see him. Yeah, Gary, if you can unmute yourself, you should be able to.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Perfectly.
Nicole, thank you very much for the opportunity. My name is Gary De Silva. I'm Chairperson Fathers for Justice South Africa. I've been doing this work for 18 years. I'm very disturbed by some of the things that have been said around, violence and abuse. And as a categoric statement, we as Fathers for Justice reject all forms of violence, abuse, or neglect perpetrated by anybody against anybody in South Africa. The bottom line is that we believe that the government and the legal justice and social welfare system in South Africa has no interest whatsoever in resolving the socio-economic and educational issues that we sit with in South Africa to address violence and abuse. And one of the biggest problems that we sit with is education. Around the narrative of fathers and the absenteeism and so on and so forth, I fail to understand that because there's 68,000 fathers' rights movements in South Africa. Okay. Yeah, the vast majority of them are run by one or two guys, but that's aside from the point. Fathers are screaming to have their rights and responsibilities enshrined for their children. And until such time as that we start addressing, I hate to say this, but this is the simple fact of the matter, and we need to address it. We need to stop throwing stones at each other as mothers and fathers, and we need to get the children out of the kitchen and return the adults to the conversation that needs to be had. Rational mothers and fathers need to sit down and say, okay, enough is enough. Let's sit down and reestablish the proper rights and responsibilities that mothers and fathers have, and what a mom's going to do, and what a dad's going to do, and what is dad going to do to support mom, and what is mom going to do to support dad, so that we can raise our children into fully functional individuals, so that we can have a functioning society. I would also like to point out to you that I presented to Parliament, to the Department of Social Development, no less than 6 times last year, because they are trying to further diminish fathers' rights and responsibilities in South Africa. Let's just point that out. But the scary thing is what the current portfolio committee is trying to do is that they are trying to, with the reduction of rights and responsibilities of fathers to their children, what they now want to do is they want to now start targeting mothers to remove those children from the mother. And the vast majority of mothers are falling on hard times because of the failed socio-economic system that we have in South Africa. And what they want to do is to be able to remove the child from the mother and have no legal or social or moral responsibility to locate a loving, caring father, or irrespective of whether he's good, bad, or indifferent, to at least give that father the opportunity to care for the child. Okay? So, and what you're going to find is that in the next 5 to 10 years, you're going to find motherless children explode in South Africa exponentially to the level of
Gary, I'm
okay, sorry. Okay, but the bottom line is that the narrative needs to change, and we need to get the children, all these different agendas out, and rational mothers and fathers, women and men, need to sit down and start having a rational conversation with one another, because what you are looking at is an explosion of violence and abuse and sexual predation against children, and exploitation in the pedophile and sex slave trade industry in South Africa, if we don't have this conversation very quickly. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your views. And I think what's clear from all of the narratives and the points that have been made today is that this is certainly not a binary conversation, and this issue needs to be tackled from many different perspectives, including systems. So thank you for that, for your contribution. Terence, I'm going to ask if you could possibly, and I know that you can, because I know how eloquent you are, provide us with your input in, let's call it 5 minutes or less.
Hey everyone. Yes, thank you, Nicole. I'm sure I can do in less than 5 minutes. The old radio training should make it quick. Just unfortunately, I was only able to come in quite late in the meeting, so I'm hoping I'm not repeating anything anyone has said or asking a question anyone else has said. But my main real thought and question is about fatherhood communities, dad communities that are run by dads, that are owned by dads. I know there are people in this chat, in this meeting right now, that have started things like this before. In my work that I've done as a content creator, I've tried to do it, and it is incredibly hard for a bunch of reasons. The way men are socialized, the way society works, to give space for men to communicate, a whole bunch of, there's a whole bunch of reasons why these communities are not as successful as they could be, especially when you compare them to the kind of mom communities that do exist and are out there. So so I don't actually have any ideas about this. This is actually a question that I'm hoping the panelists are Wessel sharing my blog. Thank you so much, Wessel. I really, really appreciate that. I'm hoping that someone in the chat, maybe who has experience in these in forming communities that have dads specifically speaking and communicating around fatherhood. So sure, you can have men around a braai talking about rugby and having beer. That's great, and there's a place for that. But how do you bring dads together where the unifying basis is fatherhood? And how do you make that work? And how do you make that work for the dads in those communities? I give over my extra 2 minutes to whoever could have a good answer to that. Thank you so much, Nicole.
Terence, I thank you for your generosity, and I want to invite Patrick, Mpho, or Wessel perhaps to respond specifically around the men care communities and what's really enabled the community building, and more importantly, the sustaining of the community where fathers are coming, or men are coming together to talk about men. Don't all jump. Go ahead.
Patrick, do you want to go ahead and talk about the implementation of men care?
Thank you so very much, Wessel. Indeed, Terence, it is a mammoth task to engage fathers, especially in sessional trainings that not take a once-off, but a series of trainings, But what encourages us, Terence and the listeners, is the fact that there are spaces where men are a captive audience, like your faith-based spaces. And if you really solidify your relationship with the boards or councils of those faith-based spaces, the better for the program. Because the program should not be seen as an add-on, but should be seen as something harnessing what they are doing already. The challenges confronts our society in terms of parenting. It's across all walks of life, across all sectors of our society, and therefore there's a demand for that. Again, if we're going to implement this as a funded activity, we are running a risk when the end of funding it collapses. We have done a piloting project at various health centers, especially maternal health centers in Cape Town. One of those was 𝗳𝗀𝗵𝗲𝗿. It was very, very interesting catching fathers whilst they were still pregnant at their fragility, accompanying their partners to antenatal sessions, but also encouraging them to be present at delivery. And that kind of exposure has made fathers to be excited, because it has actually taught them a lesson that says how difficult it is to bring a child to this world, but also how difficult it is to continue to see children going to school without food. So for me, that kind of enormous work, I wish government can really say, hands up, we're taking over that kind of a pilot that we've done in Cape Town and roll it out. For me, the catalyst, a foundation phase for us to tackle so many challenges that confronts us as South Africa and as a globe starts at parenting. How I wish that we can normalize the kind of talks and chats in our spaces as friends, as colleagues, at the workplace as well, talk about issues of parenting, how benefiting it is, how challenging it is, how do we actually support each other. So if you look at the current parenting sessions in Free State and in Gauteng, they are running very smooth now because there's funding available. And how we wish that social services department can take that over and make sure that those facilitators who are doing enormous work, that is incredible, are actually supported in that kind of endeavor. Thank you so much. Bo?
Thank you, Patrick. I just want to honor Jenna Lee's hand, and that's been up. But Patrick, thank you for that reminder. It's also about when we engage fathers and as well as where. Thank you. Go ahead, Jenna Lee.
Great. Thanks so much for that. I don't think there's. I just want to keep it really brief because obviously we're running out of time. But I would love to connect with you further, Terence, after this. So we're using social media to create those spaces for fathers and to have those conversations, and we're doing that in a variety of different ways. And we've just done an amazing online dialogue facilitation around Father's Day, and we're about to release a report from that. And there's a whole bunch of different mechanisms we're using social media to do this. Obviously, in-person workshops are so important and so vital, and they really need to happen, but we're using social media as well to reach people at an unprecedented scale and get men to be having these conversations. So I'd like to connect to you after this and also just share that report and insight of how we managed to get fathers having these conversations and connecting. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jenna Lee. And I've just popped a reminder in the chat and acknowledging that some people perhaps joined late, that we will be sharing a link to a Google document or Google folder, excuse me, that has a whole bunch of resources, including ikeza's incredible work, the reports that they've already released, all of the new reports, and we'll keep filling that up. And again, just an appeal to everybody to, first of all, share that widely and also add to it. It will be a shared repository. Just in the couple of minutes that we have left, so as I mentioned at the beginning of the call, I represent an organization called Innovation Edge. We are an impact-first investor, really focused on solving sticky, intractable early childhood challenges in South Africa. And we do this by supporting entrepreneurially minded individuals and organizations to develop and to test and to launch services and products really focused on solving these challenges. And one of the areas, we call them our impact areas, is certainly this area that we've been discussing today, the area of engaging fathers in being engaged fathers. And so this is perhaps just a heads up, and we will circulate the information, but we'll be launching a call next month. So that's in July, a call for applications from, as I said, entrepreneurially minded individuals, organizations to apply for funding for their products and services. Colleen, you spoke about funding earlier. Patrick, you spoke about funding a little bit just now as well. So we'll be launching that call, and we really want to encourage whoever would like to from this call to apply, and of course to share quite widely. We have 1 minute left, and I'm a little bit of a stickler for time, so I just want to spend this last minute really by thanking all the presenters, the contributors, of course, not just for your contribution today, but for the incredible work you do in engaging fathers in South Africa and really tirelessly working in a space, I'm tongue-tied now, a space that is not an easy space to work in. And it's very, very special thanks to ÄZSEL, who really put all of this together and did all of the hard work in the background, and to all of you as the participants for really taking the time and engaging and sort of just being present. And we appeal to you to continue the conversation. This is just one conversation, and a luta continua. Thank you very much for your time. Goodbye, everybody.
Pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, ÄZSEL. Bye, everybody.
Cheers, Prof.